welcome to The Drum. I'm Steve Cannane. Coming up, what the release of Aung San Suu Kyi means for democracy in Burma, the Greens sidelined by the Liberals in the latest preference deal, and why Joe Hockey is all fired up about leaf blowers and lawnmowers. Our panel tonight, Fran Kelly from Radio National Breakfast, foreign policy commentator Thom Woodroofe and Stella from the Daily Grind. Well, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development has released a detailed report on the Australian economy, and it's taken aim at the mining tax, saying it's too low, too narrow and should be used to set up a sovereign wealth fund. The report is also critical of aspects of the NBN. But Treasurer Wayne Swan has been trying to talk up the OECD's findings, in particular its praise for the government's economic management during the global financial crisis.
What we've got here is a piece of analysis that runs through, in economic terms, the pros and cons of a whole series of issues and policy approaches. And at the end of the day, gives the government a very big tick for its overall economic strategy and a tick in terms of the sum of its parts.
Before we talk about what's in the report, Fran, who's doing the talking here? Is it the OECD or is it the Treasury?
Well, the OECD, often the OECD reports come and go and no one takes much notice because generally, they are independent in a sense, but they are very much based on the information that the Treasury of the nation affords them. So they get the information from Treasury. In fact, there's a Treasury official with the OECD. So it's generally understood that it's, country-friendly information given to them. But that's not all that's given to them, and they do an assessment, and I'm sure not every country gets a tick for their economic program in the face of the GFC, but this was a mixed bag, and you'd have to think that not all the information was handed to the OECD from Treasury. The government didn't know whether to sort of love it or hate it today, because yes, it gave them a tick for their handling of the GFC and the strong growth, but it also said that, as Malcolm Turnbull just pointed out there, that the NBN was perhaps moving too quickly and cutting out too many other technologies. Shouldn't be putting all the eggs into one public monopoly. So there was that. It also said the GST should be increased, which I'm sure...
which is no one heard of as a policy idea for years. I don't think Treasury is putting that forward. And it said that the government's mining tax should not just be a more broadly based tax, but it should also be increased and the money should go into some kind of sovereign wealth fund. So, there was a few big negatives there that Wayne Swan didn't want to talk about. Joe, that was really interesting about the mining tax, wasn't it? Because the criticism of the mining tax is it's been going too far. Now, this criticism is saying it's not going far enough.
Well, there's no doubt there's a lot in there for both sides of politics, and the fact that the OECD, which is, although the source of the information is largely national treasuries, it is a source of truth, I suppose. It's certainly a source of authority on economic matters. This is possibly the political cover that both sides need to come to the table and discuss serious tax reform.
And Thom, interesting too, the idea of the sovereign wealth fund being raised. The OECD says if you're going to have a resource rent tax, you should do what Norway's done, what Chile's been doing, and use it to build for the future, not to either reduce other taxes or use to fund infrastructure at the time.
Exactly, and the real risk in Australia is that if the revenue from the mining goes lower than expected, then because all of that revenue is locked into spending now, then there's obviously a spending shortfall. But as Fran was saying, these reports come and go all the time, and if they're positive, the government will use them or they'll pull out the positive parts of them. And if they're not so positive, then they won't. But it says the NBN is sort of structurally sound. It's just that it shouldn't be monopolised.
I think with the mining tax, though, you can see perhaps the hand of Treasury in there, because remember that it was the Henry Tax Review that came up with the whole mining tax, the Mark 1, which was a bigger tax, a broader base across more resource fields. And I don't think the plan in the Henry Tax Review was that they necessarily use it. It was a suggestion that they use it to cut back company tax rate, but not all the other stuff. So I think there'd be plenty in Treasury who would be cheering that particular recommendation.
Just going to something that Thom said, the OECD isn't saying that the NBN is structurally sound. They're saying the exact opposite. They're saying that the business model is wrong, the idea of having a massive government monopoly rolling out a parallel internet infrastructure and closing down the existing infrastructure, and they're also saying the government shouldn't be picking winners on technology.
But they do...
that is a structural problem.
They do say that the NBN is an asset that would be good for Australia in a whole range of ways. They do make the point, though,
there is a positive message there too about Australia rolling out to fast-speed broadband finally.
Nobody disputes that the internet is a good thing.
It is effectively an idealistic report. When you look at it, it's not just the GST coverage on food as well, it's things on childcare and healthcare as well, and all these sort of things are almost politically not going to be able to happen in Australia anyway. So
Well,
Joe, on the point of the
policy.
NBN, Alan Kohler wrote some interesting comments on the drum this afternoon. He said the OECD's apparent suggestion that the whole thing be put off for as yet unknown technology is bizarre. He said on that basis you'd never do anything.
Weren't they saying that rather, because part of the deal is that Telstra cuts off its copper wire and the cables that we're currently using for Foxtel, I think, so it replaces all of that into your home. And they're saying, well, if that's working and it's currently there, why would you do that? That's a waste of money, which is the Malcolm Turnbull argument.
That's right.
And the argument from some other telco billionaires from a few other countries who've been dropping by lately.
The issue with a big bang is the government is making one decision on technology, and you've got to assume that for $43 billion they intend for this technology to be there for a long time. Whereas what the OECD is saying is not scrap the NBN, they're not saying don't roll out more internet technology. They're simply saying, let's slow it down, let's see what the pace of technological change is, let's see where the market is in 5 years.
But it's effectively a bob each way, which is exactly the point that Alan makes today on the drum.
And also, you know, I think Australians are pretty tired of hearing let's slow down the rollout of fast-speed broadband in this country. That's the political problem, the opposition. Well, I just think people want to have high-speed broadband.
Well, if you go to the communities where it has been rolled out, what they're saying is, why do we have this? This doesn't interest me. I don't want to pay $100 a month for internet that's faster
it's
than
price
I need for
sensitive,
email.
no doubt about that. Yeah.
OK, well, the OECD has also weighed in on the government's climate change policy, saying it should move quickly to put a price on carbon. This morning, the Minister for Climate Change, Greg Combet, announced an inquiry by the Productivity Commission into what the rest of the world is doing to put a price on carbon.
What the Productivity Commission will be doing is to look at the effective carbon price operating by virtue of a whole host of policies in economies with which we trade. That's their brief.
Fran, that's Greg Combet speaking to you this morning on Radio National Breakfast. Why have they brought in a Productivity Commission inquiry into this?
I think it's a political strategy as much as anything, because what killed it off last time and basically killed off Kevin Rudd's leadership and Labor's election victory chances, clear chance of victory, was the Tony Abbott's great big new tax scare. This does two things. It provides cover. If the government goes ahead with an ETS, which is what it wants to do, it provides cover for the fact that, you know, the America's not doing it. Oh, we're going out too far in front of the rest of the world. We'll be penalising our own industry. It's not fair. If it's got the Productivity Commission report in hand, which says, well, actually, you know, 86 countries or whatever it is already have price on carbon in these various ways, and this is how much these elements, what they do to the price of carbon. And that's one thing. It gives you cover that we're going alone. We're not. We're actually trailing behind a lot of the world and a lot of American states even. But also it will give a comparative price on carbon, and if it shows that the cheapest way to get a price on carbon is an emissions trading scheme, some kind of cap and trade scheme, well then that blunts a little Tony Abbott's great big new tax scheme. I think it does that. It also provides cover on the other side, because we know the Greens, certainly not enamoured with the Labor Party's ETS scheme, preferring at the moment some kind of carbon tax. And if, again, this report comes back and shows, well, the cheapest way overseas, international price on carbon is through some kind of cap and trade scheme, it bolsters the government's case there.
Joe, why does the Productivity Commission need to get involved in this? Surely this information's out there and we could glean it in some other way?
It's interesting that a minister in this government would say, let's get a bit more rigour in policy making and then go to the Productivity Commission. But that sort of point scoring aside, I think it would be really interesting to see if it can provide that sort of cover, because this government has received reports from the Productivity Commission before and they've been ignored. Parallel importing on books springs to mind.
That's true. A large part of the Gambling Productivity Commission
inquiry. That cuts both ways, though. You know, you have the opposition, you have Barnaby Joyce saying one day that he wipes his bottom on Productivity Commission reports, and so at another point they're calling for the Productivity Commission to inquire into to a cost-benefit analysis on the NBN or on water.
Absolutely.
You know, so it does cut both ways with both sides of politics.
In desperation, the government has turned to the Productivity Commission on this issue, which is really a political third rail at the moment. It will be interesting to see, once the report comes out, is Labor going to take it seriously? Because it's undoubtedly going to say no more handouts to special interest groups in the name of environmentalism. That's going to be difficult for the ALP to swallow. And secondly, is the Australian public, is the media, is the opposition going to accept what the Productivity Commission recommends?
Thom, what's your take on it?
I mean, you classically don't commission a report unless you know the outcome to some extent. And I think exactly as Fran's saying, it will politically excuse the issue somewhat until May, particularly ahead of Cancun, the next climate negotiations next month, which Gillard probably won't attend, and Combe will lead our delegation too. But I think you would probably expect to see this issue ramped up again around the middle of next year when this is released, before the election cycle starts again.
It was also, another political angle here, it was also a request or a demand, I'm not sure how strongly it was put, from Tony Windsor.
That's right, during the negotiations,
That's right. He's put his hand up to be on that cross-party climate committee. He's not particularly persuaded that we need an ETS or a carbon tax would be good for his constituency, and he's more interested in direct action, but he wants to know what the rest of the world is doing, what's world best practice. That's a particular lot of information he's requested, so this feeds into that.
Well, the price on carbon was one of the issues that Julia Gillard also talked about with US President Barack Obama at the APEC summit on the weekend. Ms Gillard says President Obama still supports a cap-and-trade system, but has accepted that it won't get through Congress. The Prime Minister flew into Canberra this morning after attending the G20 and APEC. And Thom, you were there yourself. Now, Julia Gillard was criticised for her first tour of various other parts of the world, where she said that she was more comfortable in a classroom than meeting with world leaders. What did you make of this trip?
Well, look, I think she's still very much finding her feet on the world stage, though she is certainly impressing other leaders from what we heard, and I met personally with her yesterday as well. Certainly Obama and his aides were impressed with her coverage across a range of issues without briefing papers, was the talk going around after that. But, she's certainly getting around. I think this is the 9th country she's now visited as Prime Minister. In the same period, she's visited more countries than Kevin Rudd did and became Kevin 747. That's partly just, the period of the year when a lot of these multilateral forums take place. But at the end of the day, she is naturally sort of still retreating to those domestic issues she's comfortable with. When she was in Seoul at the G20, she was speaking about banking reform. When she was at APEC on Saturday, she was talking about education and skills agendas in the region. So, as I say, I think she's still finding her feet and naturally retreating to those areas she's comfortable in.
Joe, still finding her feet?
Well, I must say I'm envious of Thom. The Prime Minister won't return my calls. But she did profit from...
I'm a little envious too.
She did profit from low expectations, I will say that. But at the same time, she was very clever in terms of using this sort of international backdrop to ensure that she was still engaged with the debate back home on key issues. What I thought was really heartening, though, the partisanship aside, was that she reaffirmed the sort of mainstream consensus in Australian politics that the US alliance is the most important part of our security apparatus, and that Australia is a steadfast supporter of free trade. So both those things were great to see.
Both those things are not surprising. I mean, the headlines today in the papers that, Australia pitches for free trade. Well, since